Imagine a world on the edge of collapse where your nation faces an unstoppable enemy, your leaders have lost their nerve, and faith is wearing thin. In the middle of this fear and confusion, one woman stands up, not with weapons or political power, but with unshakable faith and fearless courage. Her name is Judith, and her story is unlike anything you'd expect. Judith was a widow from the small town of Bethulia. By all outward appearances, she was just another woman living quietly in the shadows of war. She had no military training, no official authority, and no expectation placed on her to lead. But what she did have was a heart rooted deeply in her devotion to God, and a boldness that refused to stay silent when her people were on the brink of destruction. The thread came from the Assyrian Empire, led by the brutal king Nebuchadnezzar and his feared general, Holofernes. City after city had fallen to their wrath, and now Israel's walls were surrounded. The people were terrified. Even their elders, those who were supposed to guide and protect, had begun to give up hope. They questioned if God was still with them. To them, defeat seemed inevitable, but not to Judith. In the face of overwhelming fear, Judith saw an opportunity not to retreat, but to rise. She understood the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about saving a town. It was about restoring faith in a God who had never abandoned his people. While others panicked, Judith prayed. While leaders debated, Judith listened for divine direction. And while the men hesitated, she stepped into a role no one expected: the courageous deliverer of her people. What makes Judith extraordinary isn't just what she did, it's who she was. She wasn't driven by pride, ambition, or fame. Her bravery came from a deep belief that God could still act, even through someone as unlikely as herself. She didn't see her status as a widow as weakness. Instead, she used her voice, her wisdom, and her unwavering trust in God to challenge fear itself. Judith's story begins not in the halls of power, but in quiet faith and private surrender. And that's exactly what makes it so powerful. Because sometimes the most extraordinary heroes rise not from strength, but from surrender, and not from position, but from purpose. To understand the weight of Judith's story, we have to first understand the enemy she was up against. This wasn't just a political conflict or a clash between nations. It was a terrifying confrontation with a military machine unlike anything Israel had ever faced. At the center of it stood two names that sent chills down the spine of every survivor: Nebuchadnezzar and Holofernes. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Assyrians in the story, was a ruler obsessed with domination. He wasn't interested in alliances or coexistence. He demanded total submission, absolute loyalty from every nation, every city, and every person. If a kingdom didn't bow to him, he crushed it, no exceptions. His word was law, and his wrath was legendary. To enforce this brutal vision, he relied on one man, General Holofernes. Holofernes wasn't just a military commander. He was Nebuchadnezzar's enforcer, the embodiment of terror. Wherever he went, destruction followed. Cities were burned to the ground. Resistance was met with mass executions. He didn't just fight battles. He sent a message: oppose Assyria, and you'll be wiped out. By the time Holofernes turned his eyes toward Israel, he had already destroyed entire nations. His army was massive, well-equipped, and merciless. It was like watching a storm slowly rolling across the land, flattening everything in its path. And now, that storm was camped right outside the gates of Israel. The Israelites were terrified. Their leaders were paralyzed by fear. They'd seen what had happened to neighboring lands, and they knew they didn't stand a chance in a fight. The people of Bethulia, Judith's hometown, found themselves surrounded, their water supply cut off, and their future uncertain. Every day, the enemy inched closer. Every night, their hope grew dimmer. This wasn't just a military threat, it was a crisis of faith. The people began to wonder if God had abandoned them. How could they survive this? How could they fight back when even their strongest warriors were losing heart? And that's exactly what makes Judith's courage so powerful. Because when Israel's greatest nightmare was knocking at the door, and when fear had taken hold of everyone else, she didn't run. She didn't beg for mercy. She stepped forward with no sword in her hand, but with fire in her soul, ready to face the very man who represented everything her people feared most. When everything was falling apart, Judith didn't turn to weapons or alliances, she turned to God. And in a world driven by power, strength, and survival, that kind of faith made her stand out like a burning flame in the middle of darkness. At this point in the story, things were bleak. The Assyrians had surrounded Bethulia, cutting off its water and isolating its people. The siege was suffocating. Inside the city, panic was spreading fast. The elders, the very leaders who were supposed to guide the people, were losing hope. Some even started suggesting that if God didn't save them soon, they'd surrender. In other words, they were preparing to give up not just their city, but their faith. But Judith couldn't stay silent. She didn't just disagree, she called them out. In Judith 8:12, she boldly asked, "Who are you to put God to the test today?" Her words cut through their fear like a blade. She reminded them that God's timing isn't something we control. Just because He hasn't acted yet doesn't mean He won't. And just because things look impossible doesn't mean He's absent. Judith wasn't trying to play the role of a prophet or a warrior. She was simply someone who knew, deep down, that God was still faithful. While others saw disaster, she saw an opportunity for God to show His power. She wasn't naive, she knew the danger, but her confidence didn't come from the situation. It came from her trust in a God who had delivered Israel before and could do it again. And this is where her story begins to shift from personal conviction to public courage. Judith didn't just pray, she acted. But every move she made was soaked in prayer, fasting, and humility. She didn't trust in herself, she trusted in God working through her. What makes Judith so unique is that her faith wasn't passive. It wasn't just waiting around for God to do something. It was active, living, breathing. She took responsibility. She confronted fear. And she inspired everyone around her to lift their eyes beyond the walls, beyond the enemy camp, and back to the God who had always been with them. Judith's greatest weapon wasn't a sword. It was her faith. A faith that challenged leaders, a faith that held steady under pressure, and a faith that dared to believe that God still saves even when the odds say otherwise. When everyone else was paralyzed by fear, Judith did something no one saw coming. She decided to walk straight into the heart of the enemy camp. Alone, no army, no weapons, just her faith, her courage, and a plan that would risk everything. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. Judith didn't charge in blindly. She knew the danger she was walking into. Holofernes, the ruthless general of the Assyrian army, had crushed every city in his path. He showed no mercy. To get close to him was to walk into certain death. But Judith believed something deeper, that God had placed this mission on her heart, and He would be the one to deliver Israel, even if it came through the hands of a widow. She began her preparation the way she always did, through prayer. Judith fasted, humbled herself before God, and sought divine direction not for her glory, but for her people's survival. She wasn't acting out of impulse or pride. She was driven by a quiet but fierce conviction that God still had a plan, and she was willing to be part of it no matter the cost. Then came the boldest part of her plan. Judith took off her mourning clothes, the sackcloth and ashes of grief, and transformed herself. She dressed in fine garments, anointed herself with oil, adorned herself with jewelry, and styled her hair with care. It wasn't about vanity. It was strategy. She knew how the world worked. She knew Holofernes would underestimate a beautiful, unarmed woman. She used that to her advantage. Judith wasn't walking into that camp as a victim. She was stepping into enemy territory as a woman on a mission. Her outward appearance was disarming, but her heart was fully armed with clarity, wisdom, and the unwavering belief that God was with her. As she approached the Assyrian camp with only her maid beside her, the soldiers were stunned. Who was this woman? What was she doing here? They didn't know that behind her gentle voice and graceful presence was a woman who had already stared death in the face and refused to flinch. This wasn't just a plan, it was a leap of faith, a holy act of resistance wrapped in silence, beauty, and precision. Judith didn't wait for someone else to rise. She stepped into the darkness herself, believing that even in the enemy's tent, God could still be victorious. Judith's journey wasn't just spiritual, it was tactical. Before walking into the most dangerous place imaginable, she made a choice that might seem surprising. She changed her appearance completely. But this wasn't about vanity. It was about mission. Judith understood something deeply, that in the right hands, even beauty could become a weapon of faith. After days of fasting, prayer, and mourning in sackcloth and ashes, Judith set those garments aside. She washed, perfumed her skin, dressed in her finest clothes, put on jewelry, and arranged her hair with care. This transformation wasn't to draw attention to herself. It was to disarm her enemy. She knew Holofernes was a man who ruled through ego and desire, and she was stepping into his world with eyes wide open. She didn't disguise her identity, she embraced it. Judith used what she had, not to manipulate, but to fulfill a purpose she believed God had given her. Her outward beauty became part of the strategy, but the real power came from her inner strength, her faith, and her clarity of purpose. To the people of Bethulia, watching her leave the city in such elegant attire must have been confusing, maybe even heartbreaking. Some probably feared she was walking to her death. Others might have doubted her motives. But Judith wasn't driven by fear or opinion. She was focused. Every step she took was an act of obedience, not to man, but to God. What makes this moment so powerful is that Judith's transformation wasn't just physical, it was deeply spiritual. She had already prepared her heart through prayer. Now she was preparing her presence for the task ahead. She knew the stakes. If she failed, it wouldn't just cost her life, it could mean the destruction of her people. But she moved forward anyway, not because she was fearless, but because her faith was stronger than her fear. In our world, beauty is often portrayed as superficial or self-serving. But Judith flips that idea on its head. In her hands, beauty becomes a shield, a tool, even a battlefield. She didn't use it to exalt herself. She used it to walk into danger with confidence and precision, trusting that God could use every part of who she was to bring about victory. Judith didn't just dress for the part, she embodied it. Her preparation was an act of worship, her courage a form of surrender. And in doing so, she reminded the world that God can work through anything, even a widow's beauty, for His divine purpose. What makes this moment so powerful is that Judith's transformation wasn't just physical, it was deeply spiritual. She had already prepared her heart through prayer. Now she was preparing her presence for the task ahead. She knew the stakes. If she failed, it wouldn't just cost her life, it could mean the destruction of her people. But she moved forward anyway, not because she was fearless, but because her faith was stronger than her fear. In our world, beauty is often portrayed as superficial or self-serving, but Judith flips that idea on its head. In her hands, beauty becomes a shield, a tool, even a battlefield. She didn't use it to exalt herself. She used it to walk into danger with confidence and precision, trusting that God could use every part of who she was to bring about victory. Judith didn't just dress for the part, she embodied it. Her preparation was an act of worship, her courage a form of surrender, and in doing so, she reminded there. Judith had made it all the way into the heart of the enemy camp. She stood face to face with Holofernes, the man who had destroyed nations and terrified an entire people. But she wasn't afraid. She didn't tremble. Instead, she waited. With quiet strength and unwavering focus, she watched and listened, knowing the right moment would come. And when it did, she didn't hesitate. Holofernes welcomed Judith into his tent with arrogance and desire. He believed she was just another spoil of war, a beautiful woman seeking protection, maybe even power. He had no idea who she really was or what she had come to do. Judith played the role perfectly. She flattered him, honored him, fed his ego, but never once lost sight of her mission. Every word she spoke was carefully chosen. Every move was deliberate. Then came the night of the feast. Holofernes threw a lavish banquet and invited Judith to join him. He drank heavily, celebrating in advance what he thought would be his victory over Israel. Judith watched calmly as he slipped deeper into drunkenness, his guard falling with every sip. By the time he collapsed onto his bed in a stupor, he was completely vulnerable, unaware that he had just welcomed his own judgment. The camp was silent. The guards relaxed. No one suspected anything. Judith was alone in the tent, standing over the most dangerous man in the region. This was the moment. And she didn't run. She walked to his bed, lifted his own sword, the very weapon that had brought death to so many, and with both hands she struck. The blow was swift, final, and shockingly personal. She didn't send someone else. She didn't pray for lightning to fall from the sky. She stepped into the most intimate space of her enemy and carried out justice with her own hands. In that moment, Judith wasn't acting out of rage or revenge. She was fulfilling a purpose. She believed that God had placed her there to bring deliverance to her people. And through her obedience, Israel's worst nightmare was suddenly over. The head of Holofernes, the symbol of Assyrian power, was no longer attached to its body. Judith placed it in a sack, gathered herself, and quietly slipped out of the camp. What she carried back wasn't just a head. It was proof that God still fights for his people, even through the hands of a widow. It was victory wrapped in silence, courage, and divine justice. Judith didn't just return to Bethulia with the severed head of Holofernes, she returned with a miracle. What had seemed like a hopeless siege just the day before was suddenly flipped on its head. Israel had been surrounded, desperate, and ready to surrender. But now, everything had changed. At dawn, the gates of Bethulia opened, and Judith stood before the people holding undeniable proof of God's intervention. The head of the enemy general, the very man who had terrified them, was now in her hands. People erupted in shock, then in praise. Despair gave way to awe. Fear gave way to faith. The same town that had been whispering doubts about God's presence now shouted his name with joy. But the miracle didn't stop there. News of Holofernes' death spread like wildfire through the Assyrian camp. Soldiers who had once marched with ruthless confidence now panicked. Their leader, invincible in their eyes, was gone. Killed in his own tent by a woman, their order collapsed. Their courage shattered. Without direction or leadership, the mighty Assyrian army turned into a mob of terrified men, scrambling to flee. That very morning, the people of Bethulia, once too afraid to even leave their homes, suddenly found themselves bold, armed with faith and fresh courage. They stormed out of the city and pursued the enemy. They didn't need a grand army or years of training. What they needed and what they had was a reminder that God was still fighting for them. It was a turnaround no one could have predicted. A siege became a victory. A town that had been waiting to die now stood tall in triumph. And it all happened without a single sword being raised inside the camp. Not through brute force, not through politics, but through the faith and obedience of one woman. Judith didn't just defeat Holofernes, she reignited a nation's courage. Her action gave Israel what it had lost, hope, and not just hope that things might get better, but a living, breathing testimony that God had not forgotten them. That He still speaks, still acts, and still delivers in His way, and often through the most unexpected people. This wasn't just a military win. It was a spiritual revival, the kind that reminds a broken people that when everything seems lost, God is just getting started. Judah's victory turned the tide, and in doing so, became a defining moment in the story of Israel. Judith didn't return from her mission-seeking fame. She wasn't after power or praise, but that didn't stop the people of Israel from honoring her as a hero, because that's exactly what she was. A widow, a woman, a person overlooked by society, had become the instrument of deliverance for an entire nation. And she never once forgot where that power came from. The elders of Israel, those same men who once doubted if God would act, now bowed before Judith with reverence. They saw in her not just bravery, but something deeper. Unwavering faith, quiet strength, and a deep intimacy with God. She had walked into the enemy's tent, not out of pride, but because she believed that God was still speaking, still working, and still willing to save His people through whoever was willing to say yes. Judith lived the rest of her life in peace, respected by all, but she never remarried. She chose to remain fully devoted to God, independent, focused, and faithful. Her life became a symbol, not just of courage in battle, but of what it means to live with purpose. A reminder that when faith leads, fear loses its grip. Her story was sung for generations, passed down not as legend, but as testimony. A testimony that God can use anyone, man or woman, young or old, trained or untrained, if they are willing to trust Him fully. Judith didn't have status or resources. What she had was conviction, and that was more than enough. Today, in a world full of noise, fear, and uncertainty, Judith's story still speaks. It reminds us that faith isn't passive, it's active. It doesn't mean waiting for perfect conditions. It means stepping forward even when things look impossible. And it challenges us to ask, what risks are we willing to take for what we know is right? What would we do if we truly believed that God could work through us? Judith didn't change history by accident. She changed it through surrender, obedience, and the courage to act when no one else would. And maybe that's the lesson for us, too, that the most powerful faith isn't always loud. Sometimes it walks quietly into the heart of darkness, armed only with trust in God, and walks out carrying victory. Her story isn't just a story, it's a call to live boldly, love deeply, and believe fiercely even when the odds are against us.